The IS tanks, named after the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, were a series of heavy tanks designed as spearhead or breakthrough vehicles, which complemented the lighter and faster medium and light tanks. The idea was to create a well-protected but also well-armed heavy tank capable of engaging and destroying German heavy tanks such as the Tiger and Panther. The answer was the IS, a large tank with a very large gun capable of breaking through enemy lines. Compared to the T-34, the IS was better protected and had a more powerful cannon, but it was also more complex to produce and much more expensive. Shortly after World War II, heavy tanks became obsolete and were replaced by the heavy-medium hybrids known as MBTs, or main battle tanks, vehicles that were well armed and well protected, but didn't have to be slow as a result. The IS was a devastatingly powerful vehicle. Its 122mm gun capable of delivering a huge explosive shell, but it could also punch through enemy armour. It was the IS-2 that spearheaded the attacks into Berlin in May 1945 and helped bring about the end of the fascist regime. The IS-85, which later became known as the IS-1, this took design cues directly from the KV-13 and the earlier KV-85, particularly the sloped cast hull, which was inspired directly by the failed KV-13 program. The only specification that the designers had to stick to was the fact that they weren't allowed to exceed the weight of the original KV-1. So the designers kept this in mind. The armament they chose initially was the D5T 85mm, which was also used on the KV-85 and later on the T-34-85 and Su-85, and this had much greater range and initial muzzle velocity than the F-34, which the T-34 used. The turret was also taken directly from the KV-85. It was a three-man turret, which is an improvement over the T-34's turret, in that it included a designated loader, so the commander didn't have to load the gun. The tank was designed with three machine gun mountings, one in the rear turret, one in the hull, and one coaxially with the gun, to help align the gun, as this coaxial machine gun usually fired tracers. Ammunition storage was 59 shells and 2,500 rounds for the three machine guns. The drivetrain was very similar to the KV-1's, thick large tracks which were supported by 3 pairs of double return rollers and 6 double-tied wheels which were suspended by very large torsion arms. Like vehicles before the IS-85, extra fuel tanks were attached to the rear of the hull in large drums. The IS-85 prototype started successful trials in mid-1943, but these were quite rushed. But production went ahead anyway, and was first assumed by the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant in Ukraine. The first IS-1, which became the definitive series over the IS-85, rolled off the line in October 1943, but this was stopped in January 1944 because the IS-2 was available and this was vastly superior, and because of this sudden cut in the production, only around 200 were made. But it was considered a large improvement over the KV-85 and the original T-34-76. When the T-34-85 was introduced, this caused the IS series to have to push its game up, essentially. It had to evolve to keep up with the rush of medium tank designs. So in a very early 1944, many IS-1s that hadn't yet been delivered were upgunned. There were also trials to mount a 100mm gun in the IS-1, but the 122mm was found to be a better option. The A-19 122mm. This was found to have the punch to get through the armour of a Tiger at least combat ranges. And it was this change to the armament, as well as a few other changes, that led to the next major development in the IS series, the IS-2. The IS designers realized that the IS-1 was certainly an improvement over previous designs, but with the advent of the T-34-85, this meant that a light, fast medium tank could pack the same punch as their big, slow, heavy tank, so they realized that they needed to upgun the IS to keep it ahead of the T-34 in terms of armament. But luckily the IS-1 had a large, roomy turret which could hold a larger gun, and testing began with a couple of guns, the BS-3 100mm. A single prototype was made, the IS-100, and this went into trials against the IS-122, armed with the A-19. The IS-100 apparently had better armor-piercing capabilities, but the 122mm had better all-round performance, particularly with its high explosive shells. So the IS-100 was dropped in favour of the IS-122, which became the IS-2. The Battle of Kursk, which had happened just a few months prior, had shown that the 122 and 152mm guns were the only cannons that had a real impact on very heavily armoured German tanks like the Elephant, and also heavier tanks like the Tiger and Panther. The 85mm was suitable for the T-34 because it was large enough to pack a good punch from a medium tank, but not so large that it couldn't be mounted on the T-34's small chassis. So the designers decided for the 122mm to be selected for the IS-2. It was an adapted field gun that was decided to be used, the A-19 model 1937. It had a single chamber muzzle brake, and it was fitted with a recoil cradle and a loading and lifting mechanism to slightly improve the rate of fire. Ballistic tests were performed between the A-19 and the 100mm BS-3 against a captured Panther. These tests showed the 122mm was good enough, although the 100mm was better. The 122 wasn't so much worse that it wasn't worth using. But there was one quite major problem with the A-19, which was the two-part shell. The explosive charge and the shell itself were loaded separately. This really reduced the rate of fire. A fully trained crew could fire a maximum of 3 rounds a minute. 2 rounds a minute was more usual, and the ammo supply was limited to 27 shells because the shells were large, very large, and came in 2 parts, so there was twice as much storage space required. But the A-19 had a powerful punch. The kinetic energy was more impressive than the 100mm. The weight and this energy created by this very large shell made the designers come to the decision that it would be a better idea than the 100mm, just because of the sheer power of the shell, and as I previously mentioned, its dual-purpose ability to be used as a breakthrough tank with a large HE shell, to be used against emplacements and so on. So the initial variant of the IS-2 was equipped with this A-19 gun, and production began in November 1943, which is why this model is known as the IS-2 Model 1943. This is the first model we have here in War Thunder. The IS-2 used a new frontal armor system. It was stepped, but it was blended. It had 120mm slope that was blended into the hull, which offered better resistance, but it also saved weight. The glasses could withstand an 88mm shot from a Tiger at 1,000 meters. There wasn't much room in the turret, however, because of the gun's very large recoil mechanism and the limits with the radius of the turret ring, so there was only room for a 4-man crew, which meant there was no radio operator, so the commander had to make radio contact himself. The IS-2 Model 43 used a diesel engine, the V2IC, which was very similar to the KV-1s, but it did have a few improvements. There was an inertial starter, which could use manual or electric drives, but it also had a compressed air system, which could be used to activate the engine from inside the tank. The engine also had a warming device installed in the transmission, which could be used to start the engine when it was very cold. The drivetrain was the same as the KV-85s, and by that basis was very similar to the KV-1s. 6 double-cast metal 55cm road wheels, which were suspended by strong torsion arms on each side, and 3 return rollers for each side. The front idlers were of the same variety as the road wheels to ease production, while the large rear drive sprockets were unchanged since the beginning of the development stage. The chassis was also much the same as previous models. The IS-1 had the same chassis. The transmission was a multi-disc main clutch system with 8 forward and 2 reverse gears, but the second reverse gear was never really used. Production started in full in February 44, with around 2,250 being delivered until the end of the year, and about half of these were the new 1944 model. But there were problems found with the armament. The A-19, the very slow rate of fire was almost half of that of the 85 mounted in the T-34. Other reports showed that the new armor-piercing shell used by the A-19 couldn't penetrate the Panther at less than 700 meters, and HE rounds had to be used in an attempt to jam the enemy turret, or actually blow the turret off, so the A-19 was having some difficulties with armor penetration. Next is the IS-2 Model 44. This utilized a new version of the 122mm, the D-25T. The main advantage of this weapon over the original A-19 gun was that it was geared to sustain a reduced loading time. It still used a semi-automatic system, but it was designed in such a way that a faster rate of fire could be sustained without wear and tear. The other new design feature was a single uniformly sloped front of glasses plate, which was a 60-degree angle, and this was 100mm thick, so it was simpler to produce, and it also provided better protection as it didn't have a stepped design like on the original Model 1943 IS-2. This had a step in the center which was flatter and easier to penetrate. The replacement for the IS-2, which was the IS-3, used the same gun as the IS-2, but the armor layout was completely revised. The chassis, the suspension was very similar, but the main change was the hull layout. This used a pike nose system, which had 2 inclined plates at a very great angle from the vertical when viewed from the front. The top of the hull had a backward slope. The hull sides were also inclined and well sloped. The turret was Also a new design, it was hemispherical and also slightly wider than the hull itself on top. The hemispherical turret design became a feature of virtually all Cold War tanks on the Soviet side, and even in modern Russian MBTs this hemispherical design can be recognized. The armament was the same D-25T, used since the model 1943 IS-2, which still had a very slow rate of fire, but the main innovation was the new split hull design, with this pike nose as it was known, with each side plate on the nose being 120mm thick, which provided very solid protection from the front, and also the turret was extremely sloped. This was also very well protected. Over the IS-2, the IS-3 is quite similar, the main changes being the changes to the armour. The gun was the same, the chassis was the same, but protection was increased. The IS-4 was built in parallel with the IS-3 as a possible replacement for the IS-2. The original IS-2 hull was lengthened with an extra set of road wheels and added a larger engine. Both hull and turret armour were increased, but the original 122mm was kept from the IS-2. Some improvements were based on the German Panzer V Panther tank, including the layout of the IS-4's engine cooling system. The tank was approved for mass production from 1947 to 49, but due to disappointing speed and mobility, only 250 were finished. The modernized version, also known as the IS-4M, incorporates larger, more protective track guards and stowage above the tracks. Compared to the IS-3, it's much better protected, but not as agile. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Reach for the Sky. See you soon.